Welcome to Show Money, the only show exclusively dedicated to business and mixed martial arts. I'm Paul Gift, your economist from Bloody Elbow. And as always, I'm joined by John Nash from Bloody Elbow, the man who knows everyone and everything in mixed martial arts. And we have a special show today. We don't have multiple topics like we normally do. One topic the whole day, which is the Muhammad Ali Act extension. We want to say a special rest in peace to the man who this act is in honor of, Muhammad Ali. John, do you have anything you want to share about your thoughts of him real quick?
About Muhammad Ali, just my first memory of him when I was growing up, I used to watch the Muhammad Ali cartoon that was on in the 70s. I'm a child of the 70s, and I have fond memories of watching. I didn't see his events live because I was just a little kid, but in the early 80s, I used to watch on Laserdisc at my uncle's all of his classic fights. My dad was a big fan of his, surprisingly, considering his background. But my dad was a big fan, and I loved the Ali Frazier fights, Ali Foreman, of course, his early days with Floyd Patterson and Liston and Wells and Wepner later, Chuck Wepner. So a lot of fond memories. The guy was an incredibly talented, incredibly important, incredibly complex human being, and he kind of is deserving of the accolades of a head of state almost that he's getting right now. So.
Yes, absolutely. I grew up a lot of my life in Indiana and was a basketball kid growing up. But so I got into boxing and MMA later, but still love going back and watching all of his fights on YouTube. So rest in peace there. And another thing that we're not going to spend a lot of time on today, but just want to briefly mention to share our support for Ariel Helwani, Esther Lynn, and Casey Layden. I've never met Ariel personally, but I'm good friends with Esther and Casey, and what happens there seems to be a bit of a MMA media travesty, in our opinion. I wish we could somehow. One thing we always say, or at least I always say on this show, is that every significant UFC decision is either made by or approved by Lorenzo Fertitta. We can talk about Dana White all they want, but the guy who effectively owns 80% of that company is Lorenzo Fertitta, and I would love to know what the sort of the business justification for that is going through his brain. But we are not going to talk or speculate about that. We're going to get into the Professional Boxing Safety Act and what was officially submitted by Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen last week is the Muhammad Ali extension of the act that still has to go through Congress and be approved. But we're going to go through all the details of it and just share some thoughts on it. We might be joined by a special guest later. And you'll notice that we don't have Jason Cruz with us today. That's because he's off gallivanting in Hawaii. So he's having a lot of fun, and we're going to do our thing here. The extension passed last week. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, you kind of don't want to because it's really annoying to go through. It says things like, Section 4A of the Act is further amended by inserting, quote, and combat sports regulations after, quote, professional boxing regulations. So you don't want to read through that. So we've done it for you. Here's the gist. I'm going to give you a rundown of what's been added, and then John will take you through some other elements, and then we'll talk about questions we have about what this could mean. So in the definition section, what they added, because this act is pretty much about boxing, so they added a fighter, an individual who fights in a professional mixed martial arts competition or other professional combat sport competition. Then they added combat sport competition, the definition of that. This one's interesting. A professional fight that allows fighters to use one or more forms of martial arts, including mixed martial arts, and it doesn't include weapons or amateurs. So that right there suggests that grappling, anything that uses at least one form of martial arts, things like grappling, would be under this act. Throughout the whole entire act, they basically took anywhere the word boxer is, they throw in potentially and or fighters. And then if there's a boxing match, they throw in a combat sport competition. And then we go down a little bit more. And so the first major change is if this act goes through and passes and becomes law, within 2 years, the Association of Boxing Commissioners, the ABC, has to come up with minimum guidelines for contractual provisions that will be in MMA contracts. And they have to come up with guidelines for objective and consistent written criteria for the ratings of fighters. They actually are pulled pretty much the exact two clauses that are already in the act. They're just applying them now to MMA, and they have 2 years to come up with these things. There's a section that says basically any fighter's contract that is signed before this bill goes into law is sort of grandfathered in, so contracts won't be changed retroactively. Let's see if we go down a little bit more. The firewall between a promoter and a manager, that it applies in boxing when when a bout is of 10 rounds or more. That is now, at least according to this draft, going to apply to MMA for competition that's scheduled for 11 minutes or more. So in most MMA organizations, that pretty much captures every bout. And then we go on down a little bit further, and is that it? That's the main thing. A lot of my main takeaway from this, we're going to hear from John in a second, is basically the Muhammad Ali Act as it is written right now. They didn't do a lot of changes for MMA. They essentially added a few things for MMA, but kept a lot. And we'll hear from John on what some of that is.
Oh, well, okay. Here I'm going to do a quick rundown of what's in the Muhammad Ali Reform Boxing Act, and then me and Paul will go back and forth what the changes mean for combat sports. But the key elements of the Muhammad Ali Reform Boxing Act that fans of MMA and combat sports want to pay attention to is, one, it requires disclosure from the promoters. The promoters have to disclose to the fighters the compensation, the revenue they get from an event. It doesn't work that they have to tell them everything. They have to tell them the night before the event what revenues they have coming in, but it gives a fighter a sense of how much money their events are making. It doesn't tell them expenses, but obviously it gives them a sense of how much money is coming in. Another provision in the Muhammad Ali Reform Boxing Act is that there's a provision against coercive contracts. And coercive contracts are identified as contract options extensions that a promoter can apply to having a contract that adds more than 1 year to a fighter's contract. There's some question, even in the boxing end, does this cover all options, or does it only cover options of a boxer that's not with a promoter that has to fight one of his boxers? It's basically the anti-Don King rule. It was changed from its original, much more clearer terminology when lobbyists from Bob Arum and Don King spent a lot of money with Harry Reid to change that. So it's a little vague, but it would seem to apply to stuff like the championship clause in MMA. There's also, on the course of contract, is whenever there's a mandatory bout dictated by a sanctioning body, there cannot be any contractual provisions required, any contractual rights required by promoter to put that fight on. So if a sanctioning body with boxers made a mandatory match between two boxers, neither a promoter that won the bid to take that match couldn't demand that the boxer sign with him for a long-term contract. He can only put on that one match. Another provision that's important is there's a firewall, and the firewall between a promoter and between a promoter and a manager, which is supposedly supposed to protect boxers from having their managers having financial interest in the promotion, so they're not looking out for their best interest. And there's also a firewall between a promoter and a sanctioning body. And we will get into the whole sanctioning body thing later, because that's probably the biggest conundrum in the whole bill with MMA, and potentially the manager one too. We'll talk about later. And then the final one is that there's the final one that we'll talk about today is the requirement of an independent ranking under the Ali Act, that the ranking system has to be independently done, and they have to post the reasoning behind their rankings. So those are all the ingredients of the Ali Act. And now we get to talk about, first of all, do they even mean anything? Are they enforced? And most importantly, what does this mean for MMA? Because there is a ton of variables involved here that I think a lot of people are either not aware of, or not paying attention, or just never made aware of.
Yeah, and so let me start with just some numbers for people, since I am the MMA numbers guy. But in this Congress, so what people should know is, right, this is a bill that's been put forth, and it has to go through a few levels before it gets voted into law. And so in this Congress, there have been 9,922 proposed pieces of legislation, and 165 of them have been enacted into a law, which is about 2%. And every Congress that we've had since 2007, they've passed 3% or fewer of their pieces of legislation. And if this bill doesn't get enacted into law by January 3rd, the process will start all over again. So everything will reset and we'll go into our 115th Congress and the process has to start all over again. So that's sort of what it's facing right now. And it's interesting that it was sort of put forth this late in the game, but I don't know what Mullen's thoughts on that would be.
One thing we should note, first of all, well, actually, besides Mullen, he has a co-sponsor in Joseph Kennedy III from Massachusetts. That's a co-sponsor across the aisle. And I do know of several 10 congressmen that also support it at least. The one thing that improves the odds from that 3% or 2% is the most likely is a lot of those bills that are proposed are very partisan, are only proposed purely for show for back home. So a lot of them get. So the question is, does this get any sort of bipartisan support, and does it get sexy enough that congressmen start jumping on it, and then Senate? I give it a higher percentage than 3, maybe 7, maybe 10. It's still low, but I think it's higher than the 2 to 3%.
Yeah, and that those numbers also include things like resolutions and stuff like that. So it's definitely not clean numbers.
Yeah. So, but on top of okay, so let's start. I guess the first thing is we talked about. Well, let's go through each of the little things, and we'll talk about how that's going to affect MMA. I guess the one that are the least controversial, I think the easiest is one is the guidelines written by the ABC to make and what in boxing they did, they wrote guidelines. They wrote basically a template contract for beginning boxers. They can go to the ABC websites, and then they can just download a contract. So they have an already filled out contract with all the provisions they should have in a basic contract. I think this is a no-brainer for MMA. It doesn't really affect much. What it does is for early MMA fighters, now they have something they can download and present to early promoters and managers and say, this is the contract I should sign. Without all the that's the second provision that probably less controversial is going to be disclosure. And we've, I talked to a lot of fighters. That's something they would love to have. If there's questions of how much will really be disclosed, but it's probably a lot more than is currently. And I know a lot of fighters love that. A lot of promoters, I'm sure, dislike that immensely. I mean, do you see any big controversy with the disclosure?
No, well, I mean, everybody's going to. The thing, if there's one thing we've learned about, I don't know how much other promoters are going to fight, but the one thing we learned about the UFC is they have the financial resources to fight, and they will fight even something that seems like it might be relatively minor. But these disclosures, everything I see in this act, all I see is areas where the UFC could also do two things. One is you fight like hell to change it before it passes. Mm-hmm. And then two is if and when it passes, is there enough ambiguity that you can do what you want to do and sort of force someone to sue you and have to go through all of the different lawsuit elements? And you're the UFC with a big financial backing and the ability to fight these things and not necessarily want to settle them right away, which is what we've seen in the antitrust lawsuit, right? We know they're going to fight like hell until summary judgment is over, trial is right upon us, and maybe they'll think about settling. But so the thing that gets me is kind of the, from Jason Cruz's article about Joseph Abetko that one of his, his promoter fought that one clause about, where is it? So what am I thinking of? It's the disclosures for, I haven't even have it written down here. Just give me a second. Here we go. Contracted to receive, right? The revenues you have to disclose are not your final revenues. It's the revenues that you're contracted to receive. And so you're reading that and you're like, does that include Fox revenues? Yeah, probably. Yeah. They're contracted to receive revenues from Fox. But does it include advertiser revenues? I don't know, because it says from such a match. So if an advertiser like Monster or Harley Davidson or whoever has an annual contract, is that from such a match? I'm not really sure. Does it include pay-per-view? It sounds like no, but I don't know. Well, merchandise sales, food and beverage, is all this stuff.
From my understanding, the pay-per-view, here's the thing that's makes it a little more complex for fighters, and is that pay-per-views will be revealed, but the pay-per-view numbers aren't back yet because the numbers revealed the day before the match. That's when it's due to be released to you. So it's the day before your match is your information's given. You don't have stuff that doesn't have final pay-per-view sales. You don't get. You'll get ticket sales. You'll get the gate. You'll get, you'll get TV revenue, contractual rights, but you won't get stuff like you'll know maybe what the pay-per-view split is. I guess they'll tell you what their pay-per-view split is, but they have no numbers yet to share with you.
Right.
So that's not given. But there, and then you do bring up a good point though, I guess, is if it's an annual, if Reebok is paying, or Monster is paying the UFC for a whole year in the cage, do they reveal that? Is that something that it's not for that bout, it's for the UFC only? That gets to be, that's something boxing doesn't do, because boxing set up event by event almost.
Right. Yeah. And so it feels like the UFC would have leeway to not disclose things and then fight it. Oh, this is not revenue I received from such a match. So I'm not 100% sure. I know that they're going to fight this tooth and nail.
Yeah.
But even if it goes through, I'm not sold on how much information is actually going to be disclosed from this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, based on stuff I've seen before, there's you'll get more than they have before. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's stuff like, there's a lot. I mean, some events UFC sells tons of merchandise. They do $1 million at some events of T-shirts and all that junk being sold at the stadium. Well, the next day, you don't know that. You didn't know that the event made an extra $1 million while you were there,
Right.
So
the day before.
Yeah, you don't know if the event sold 500,000 pay-per-views or 1.5 million unless you have the right to, which is supposedly kind of useless, to audit the UFC's pay-per-view sales. Apparently, it's only been taken. Only a couple people have done that because.
Right.
So that's, but at the same time, I think that's one that's controversial from promoters. They hate that idea. But I don't think that's something fans or fighters are against. I know fighters and managers love that. There's fighters. A while ago, Tim Kennedy once told me, he goes, just that little thing would make a huge difference. And that's the same thing boxing promoters told me. But again, there will be a lot of curveballs thrown, I'm sure, by the UFC, because they do not like disclosing that stuff.
Oh yeah, if you're a fighter or a manager, you should be all over this.
And that's the other weird thing too. Like Bellator. Bellator is owned by Viacom. Their price for those shows is probably set by Viacom, not based on. I'm not sure Bellator's negotiating the highest price for every event. No, they're negotiating the price that Viacom gives them for that event.
Yeah, and if you have to start disclosing it, I wonder if that number would change.
Yeah, it's like if they're disclosing the fighters, it might not. It doesn't matter because the price has been probably been set by what they need just for that event.
Right.
So it's like that doesn't really tell you that much. But again, it still could be. I think it could be useful in the future going forward too, based on different promotions get involved. You never know what's going to happen in the future. So, but that's two, and that's a pretty obvious one. Everybody gets that. Now we get into the stuff that gets a little more complex, a little more confusing for a lot of fans, and for us, and for everybody. Actually, I guess the first one is that the independent rankings. Let's do that one first.
I thought you were going to sanctioning bodies.
No, we're saving that is such a can of worms. We're saving that last. Sanctioning bodies are the last. Independent rankings. Again, according to the Ali Act, you need to have independent rankings that can be justified. You have to post on the website how you came up with the rankings. These are in boxing. Everybody knows these are manipulated all the time. But they do serve a point. People won't want to hear this, but from a fighter point of view, a lot of these provisions you could argue that they're bad for the promotion, they're bad for the fans, they're bad for the sport. But for making the most of your money as a boxer and MMA fighter, these type of things would probably be beneficial to them, because theoretically the idea of the rankings is that without promoter control, and you know what, we should save this because we got to go with sanctioning bodies with this. Otherwise, it doesn't go together.
You kind of do, because it's from the sanctioning bodies.
Yeah, we need to put them in the sanctioning body of the title. So we're going to skip this one. We'll do the firewall first between managers and promoters. And we're going to go back to the independent rankings. So
let's do it.
Okay, the Ali Act calls that there has to be a firewall between a manager and a promoter. That a manager cannot have a financial interest in a promotion, and a promotion cannot have a financial interest in a fighter beyond the fight. So, I mean, the whole point of this is pretty obvious, because you want to have your managers have a fiduciary responsibility to their fighters. You don't want to have stuff like when Don King's son was managing boxers for his dad and maybe was not looking out for their best interest. We have a few examples in MMA recently with Ali Abdelaziz, the accusations against Bellator. So we have examples in this taking place in MMA. But I guess, is this something, but a lot of people argue that this would be bad for MMA because they're so common amongst the lower ranks.
Amongst the lower ranks, yeah, like Ed Soros and RFA, right? And does Titan have this issue? I think they do.
Aronson, yeah.
Yeah. Well, not Aronson, but is it Afromowitz?
Oh, I mean, I'm not tied legacies. Yeah, there's Aronson is a manager and a promoter.
Right.
There's Soros. There's Monty Cox used to.
Right.
There's Ali Aziz had this thing with he was the matchmaker. There's plenty too in the lower level. I just can't think of them right now. There's tons of guys that do it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing to this one to me is that again, I think the organization who's best financially equipped to lobby and either defeat this bill or change the terminology of this bill is the UFC. I'm not sure how much Viacom will spend on it, especially since Scott Coker said he's already for it.
Yeah.
But those small guys aren't going to be spending a lot of money, I can't imagine. Yeah. And the money that they spend probably won't have that big of an effect. And the small guy, this provision mostly means nothing to the UFC because it doesn't affect them, right? They may be indirectly in some way, but it has this effect on the small guys. And of all the things in this draft that might change, this is probably the last one that I would suspect would change. So what I spend my time focusing on is how will the little guys get around it? Will they be able to get around it? Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting too. To me, I think a lot of people make a big deal about this, but first of in boxing, they have an exemption. Anything under 10 rounds, you can be a manager and a promoter. Because in boxing, 12 rounds are title fights and 10 rounds are for sanctioned body, required bouts. That's, non-title, but sanctioned body required. So it's really for only sanctioned bouts, the major bouts, that they have this rule in place. In MMA, they propose in this bill, I've heard other versions that they floated, but in this one, 11 or more minutes has to follow the rule. Under that, they don't have to. And this is where if a promoter wanted to get around it, he could start doing 3-3-minute rounds.
Yeah.
But I guess that's dependent on states that allow you to do 3-3-minute rounds. Some states have rules written that the fights have to be 5-minute rounds. Those same states probably already have rules that are even more stringent on a firewall between managers and promoters. Nevada has one, we know that. California does. Florida has one. New Jersey has one. Massachusetts has one. New York and their boxing does. We haven't seen the MMA bill yet, how MMA will be treated, but all of them already have pre-existing firewalls between promoters and managers. So I'm not sure how this is going to be that big of a change, except for the fact that maybe promoters are going to feel athletic commissions are going to feel the need to start actually enforcing it, maybe. But besides that, I don't see it having that major change.
Right. Or it could possibly be that when it's an athletic commission rule, yeah, they're the ones that have to enforce it. Just like when I was talking to Bob Bennett about why they didn't go after World Series of Fighting and Ali Abdelaziz, versus if it's a federal law, I guess fighters could bring this action, right? Or a theory that you're going to mention later. Yeah. But then some states, and you see versions of the unified rules. I've seen versions where it says the fight is 3 5-minute rounds, and then you see another version, 3 no more than 5-minute rounds, right? So that you could play with the length of the round. And then I tossed around the theory of could you do 2 rounds and then a sudden death or sudden victory or whatever the hell we call it in MMA these days, something like that. Yeah. But so I mean, it's interesting because this thing, if this passes, I don't think this clause. My guess right now would be this clause would not change. And so, would promoters be able to get their way around it? Could you go from being a manager to an Al Heyman type advisor, and then make somebody sue you on that and see what happens? Right? Yeah. There are all these ways to try to get around it. I don't see them just sort of.
Well, yeah, and it's weird too because it's the ways the commission's already written and all the rules already written. It really shouldn't have an impact at all. Yeah. But as we know, the commissions really haven't been enforcing the manager-promoter separation. So that'll be interesting if it starts enforcing more. I mean, this is the one a lot of people make a big deal about. But this is the one I almost think is the smallest. And the guys like Monty Cox, who's running small shows without titles, and I mean he has titles, but there's no I think his contracts are 1 fight at contracts. He should really be completely immune to this. A guy of his level. He's the perfect, and I think where he runs them, I wonder if they'd let him run 3 3-minute rounds or 2 5-minute and a sudden death and let that get past it. But guys running shows in Nevada, they really have no choice. Nevada already has the firewall provision, and I believe under Nevada rules they have to be 3 5-minute rounds.
Yeah, I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think so. I think California, I think both of them have 3 5-minute rounds written into the rules.
Right.
So for their, so you'd have to go get, you have to get permission from the, yeah, I think so. Because remember when Bellator did their Dynamite, their tournaments, they've always went and got permission from the commission to do different than 3 5-minute rounds. So in the rules, it's already there. So that, I mean, that's, to me, that should not be that big a change. We've got, and now we get to the, I think now we get to the one that's the big question. I think, oh, well, but no, before we lose managers, there's one curveball with the managers and UFC. And we talked about this. So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. There's one curveball, and this is the reading it. This is the one I think is potentially something potentially troublesome to the UFC. Potentially, under the manager, under the, hold on, let me look it up really quick. The firewall, so I get the language 100% right. It's contracts. We want the disclosures. Geez, I should have circled it. It would have been a lot smarter. My conflict of interest. Okay, here we go.
Page 1918.
Yeah.
I don't know what version you have or what your document is.
Well, I'm just looking at the original Ali Act because it's just add fighters and stuff to it.
Yeah.
okay,
Section 6308, page 1918.
Okay. This is 90, which were actually say it's additional amendments. God dang it. I bet it's the last one, and it's always, I have it out of order here.
I can read it if you want. I have it.
Yeah, just read it off really quick. The firewall.
Okay. Firewall between promoters and managers. 1. In general, it is unlawful for a promoter to have a direct or indirect financial interest in the management of a boxer, or B, a manager to have a direct or indirect financial interest in the promotion of a boxer, or to be employed by or receive compensation or other benefits from a promoter, except for amounts received as consideration under the manager's contract with the boxer. Then there are exceptions.
Yeah. And so if someone wanted to take that extreme definition, basically a promoter's job is to put on a fight, a bout, and make money from that bout. A manager's job is to look after a fighter's interest and make money off a fighter's career. Here's where it gets questioned. The UFC, starting in 2008, added that merchandise deal, and then the image rights, and all these other things that expanded their interest in their fighters beyond the bouts. So does that cross over into being a manager? That they're making money off fighters, you know, with the Jacks and 5-round toys and the Topps cards and the EA, you know, the EA Sports game and all these other merchandise and all these other items that are making money for them beyond the fights themselves. And so they have an interest in their fighters now that goes well beyond just what goes on in the cage. And I think that's something the UFC might worry about, because in the future, let's say an association does come into being, or let's say a fighter with a lot of money or someone backing him decides to challenge the UFC. Maybe the federal government doesn't get involved, but because the Ali Act includes the right to private action, they could take the UFC to court on this provision. That would be a massive opening of a can of worms for the UFC if that came to fruition.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah, I agree with that. I can see that. I imagine they would say, hey, look, the commissions didn't even make us get a manager's license, and these guys all have their managers, and here's their licenses and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I can see you making that argument in court. Yeah, and it being concerning and not wanting to have to deal with it.
So, I mean, right now, I don't think any fighter would dare try it. It'd be expensive. But in the future, you never know if someone, you know, Conor McGregor pops up and he does have millions in his back pocket or something, you know.
Yeah.
Or association springs up and then starts challenging the UFC and all this different stuff all the time. That's got to be a concern. And that's one I think makes, you know, and for fighters and managers that want to, you know, for some of them that hate the deals that they got stuck into with the UFC and that were already written into the contracts, they got to be looking at that. Well, wait, we can maybe reset the whole thing now in the future. Which
is exactly the reason we know they're going to fight like hell to make sure every element of this doesn't pass. Which kind of, to me, leads into, I know we're getting into sanctioning bodies in a little bit, but leads into a kind of interesting dynamic in that, well, first off, had you ever heard of Mark Wayne Mullen before talk of this legislation came about?
I did. I heard about I had no clue he was talking about this legislation, but I heard that there was a congressman that used to be a fighter. This is like, yeah, when he got elected, some people, I can't remember if Sherdog or someone posted an article about that.
It's because there's an interesting dynamic at play, though, with him being a Republican, right? And I'm pretty sure Dana White's a Republican, right? And
no clue.
wasn't he talking about wanting to vote for Trump or something like that?
I think he's a Trump backer because Trump supported the UFC in the early days.
Right. Yeah, you might be right. Well, they definitely have the Republican connections, the Fertittas and Dana White, and so it's just so interesting, that dynamic at play to me. Right. We've got the Republican Mullen pushing for more regulation, which you generally don't see as much from Republicans, and then you've got the UFC people with their Nevada connections and what I imagine would be Republican connections, and Mullen not being a very big name, and I looked him up. The person who had his seat before him was a Democrat. So I'm just wondering if the Zuffa guys are filtering money into his congressional race right now.
Maybe, yeah. I think he comes from that school of There is a group of school Republicans that are the small business Republicans that hate big business.
Yeah,
the whole Jefferson anti-monopoly type fans that live by that. And I think he comes from that school. So, but no, it's it. I mean, because you have in the Senate, John McCain says he supports it. He's a Republican. Bernie Sanders earlier said he supported it. It'll be I mean, it's weird because there's some sort of bipartisanship, but I wonder how much bipartisan opposition there is too. And it's possible there's just a strong amount. I mean, I already know. The UFC is already picking people to lobby on this. They're spending. I don't know how great their lobbying efforts can be. They're not a monster company. It's not like you're dealing with pharmaceuticals that have just tons of money to throw at Washington. All things considered, UFC is pretty small, but they're still that this is something serious. They're pumping money into. I'm sure they're getting the Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise guys to start writing stuff already up for them, and that I think that's the first step. You'll start seeing a wave of that stuff. Guys start posting position articles so that guys can.
If McCain was leading the charge on this out there in the forefront, I would his weight and his credit and his name, I would give it a lot more higher probability of going through. The fact that it's from Congressman Mullen, who nobody has ever heard of pretty much until this point, doesn't mean it's impossible to pass. It just means it makes me wonder about the weight of the UFC lobby effort against this guy and what he wants to put through. Yeah. That's all. So I guess where that money was
going. The one good thing, I guess this is Harry Reid's last year, so I don't know how much influence he has.
Right.
And he's a strong, Fertitta ally. So, and he was the guy previously who was picked out and pointed out as the guy that changed the Ali Act based on lobbyists from King. And this isn't me saying this. This is stuff that was reported by other people that King and Arum lobbied him. I think 50,000 and 20,000 between them, his campaigns, to get him to change a provision in the Ali Act.
Right. So beyond being his last year, though, whoever replaces him, right, he's not going to have nearly the pull that Harry Reid has.
Yeah. So it's I mean, it'll be interesting. We'll see. We'll have to wait. On all that, I have no clue what the chances are. But let's go on. What's the are we up to the sanctioning bodies and the rankings? Or should we?
I think so. That to me was the biggest shocker when I read it. I mean, I wouldn't call it a full-on shock, but I did not expect the MMA version. I expected there to be the disclosure issues. I expected the firewall. I expected something about coercive contracts. I didn't know if they were going to change it or pretty much keep it the same. I did not expect basically the language on sanctioning bodies to be completely unchanged. They basically did not touch it.
Yeah, I actually was confident. I think the people that were that lobbying them, Kung Lee and those guys. I think Mullen. From a fighter's point of view, this is something the fans you got to just think from a fighter's point of view, because remember the bill is an Ali Act from the Boxing Safety Act. That was the Ali Act is specifically about the financial health of fighters. So if from a fighter's point of view, you don't want promoters controlling the titles or the rankings from a fighter's point of view. Fans might not like that. People might say it's better for the sport that the promoters control it. But from a fighter's point of view, as Carlos Newton said, when the model the MMA currently uses is the WWE. The promoter controls the belt. And if you think of it from a fighter's point of view, as any sort of evidence will show, the higher you go up in the rankings and the titles you fight for, especially important titles like UFC titles, your value increases. That's a given, right? We know that. Your value increases. And so to fight for a UFC title, to sign with the UFC, or to sign with Bellator and get a title shot with Bellator, they can dictate. They have all the leverage. They can dictate and say, well, you want to fight with us, you got to agree to our terms. Otherwise, we're not going to give it to you. And you want the title because that increases your value. So the odds are vastly in favor of the promoter. Same with the rankings. The promoter dictates who fights for the title. If they don't like you, you got to win 10 fights. If they like you, you win 1 or 2 and you get a title shot. If you're charismatic and given to their contract demands, they might give you a title shot right away. If you're a pain in the ass, they might not even sign you. And then you're stuck in the wilderness making a 10th what you could have made. So from a fighter's point of view, I could see that they seriously want that. That's not saying it's the best, for everybody, but for a fighter, I can see them really wanting that. So I was positive. When I first heard about that, I thought for sure the sanctioning body element or some sort of separation between the promoter and control of the title would be in there.
Yeah, no, I just didn't think it would be completely unchanged. I thought there'd be some tweak to it, something. But go ahead.
Oh no, I maybe. Yeah, I think they do something just to make it look like they tried.
Yeah, and from a to get a little nerdy here, from like a behavioral economics or psychology perspective, when you're negotiating, you come, if you're the first one to make an offer, you can sort of set the anchor of where that offer is going to be, and so that's the first thing I thought of is basically Mullen anchoring here, right? Yeah. He knows he's making the first play, and that they're going to fight against you like hell, so you can include this sanctioning body stuff, keep it completely unchanged so that, if the UFC is going to get any changes, that's probably going to be the first one they're going to target. And so he has the ability to sort of set where the discussion begins. And he set the bar really damn high.
And I think that also kind of explains why Bellator and other promotions would be all for the Ali Act. They would love for the opportunity to get a chance to bid on a champion out of the, you know what I mean? Oh wait, we have the number 2 guy. Let's go to purse bid. We might get the chance to get John Jones versus our guy.
Right. Yeah.
That's exactly why Bellator and them want that, because they get a chance to get fighters that are locked up in the UFC, to get them a chance to get them in their promotion.
And that leads into another thing. Well, that kind of deals with the coercive provisions a little bit and the ratings criteria. Yeah. Just to give people the verbiage here for the ratings criteria, it's basically pulled the old version, and it says it is the sense of the Congress that the sanctioning bodies and state boxing commissions should follow these ABC guidelines, and the ABC had to develop objective criteria for ratings. Mm-hmm. But when I read that, it doesn't say how you have to use them. It doesn't say there what they have to be used for. It doesn't say that the UFC can't still continue to do its own ratings as long as they're independent through whatever reporters are involved in that. So there's also a lot, while there's a lot that's included, there's a lot that's not included as well, right? That you have to have them. It doesn't say you have to use them. It doesn't say how you use them. It doesn't say anything like that.
That's the confusing part, because everything infers that you're gonna have a sanctioning body. In fact, we know from the letter that was written about Al Heyman, when there was rumors that he was going to have his own belts, that was the interpretation they had. It infers, but it's never clear cut. And way Mullen described the Ali Act when I interviewed him, and he's talked before, he even seems to say that you do not need sanctioning bodies in MMA because they don't exist. But he seems to saying, and I wonder if this is his future plan, his idea is that you need the state commissions to oversee, put up the guidelines for the rankings. Maybe some independent body does it, but the state commissions, the ABC is in charge of the rankings. The promoters have to follow those rankings. But if they do that, then maybe we won't, maybe that'll be the caveat. Then we won't need sanctioning bodies if you do this. I wonder if that's the intent.
Right. The part that I haven't seen yet, maybe you read it differently, is I haven't seen the part that says the promoters have to follow the rankings. I haven't seen that.
I haven't seen. Well, and that's if you read the sanctioning body rules of all the sanctioning bodies.
Oh yes.
Stuff, it's in there.
The boxing sanctioning bodies have those mandatory matches. Yeah.
Yeah. They don't have that. That's something that has to be clarified, or is it such a given? Like, oh, it's it's such common knowledge that we don't even have to spell it out because it's considered common knowledge. It's inferred on that, and that's a confusing one. That's really difficult. And for people that don't know, in boxing, there's sanctioning bodies. And in sanctioning bodies, what they are, they started, you know, gosh, 100, 200 years ago. And the first one, and then there's more grown. There was actually only one up to 65 with Ali, and then they split into two. But the sanctioning bodies, what they do is they sanction a title fight. They say we're the group that identifies, you know, who's fighting for the champion. We say this is the official championship bout. That's a sanctioning body. And they've expanded their you know, what they've done since then by ranking people, and they've got corruption problems too, and there's a bunch of stuff that it's, you know, boxing's full of its own bullshit. But one thing the Ali Act didn't do is the Ali Act didn't create this bullshit, because all the sanctioning bodies existed before the Ali Act came into existence. But so when people say the Ali Act is going to make, you know, that Ali Act destroyed boxing, I find that hard to believe, because all the shit existed before that.
Yeah, even though we hear on TV this bout is sanctioned by the California State Athletic Commission,
yeah,
I would think of it as regulated by the California State Athletic Commission, and then the sanctioning body is essentially the titles. Right? Yeah. But they also have their rules. Yeah, and just so people can see some, even in boxing, the mandatory titles aren't necessarily 1 versus 2 all the time. Like the WBC says you have to make at least 1 mandatory defense per year. And that could be a final elimination of 2 qualified contenders, designating a qualified challenger as official mandatory challenger, ordering a unification bout with another organization. They have discretion. They even say specifically, for the avoidance of doubt, the highest rated boxer in the WC rankings is never solely by virtue of such position the official mandatory challenger. So even there, it's not always a 1 versus 2 thing. Yeah. But this is, I mean, this law is just so much ambiguity. It doesn't necessarily mandate, it doesn't create sanctioning bodies for MMA. It's not clear whether boxing sanctioning bodies will become MMA sanctioning bodies, or if the UFC could start its own sanctioning body and only sanction UFC fights and find a workaround for the sanctioning body promoter firewall. There's to me, there's so much. It's a strong first move by Mullen, but there's so much that's not spelled out here.
Yeah, I mean, MMA, the thing is, boxing has such a long history, it's a given that you had to use the sanctioning bodies the way they're used.
Right, yeah.
MMA, it's like, again, MMA, and it's not an insult, MMA is based on the pro wrestling model. The promoter is the sanctioning body. They own the title. And as soon as you do that, it's like, well, now you've got to do a much better job explaining how you're going to get into sanctioning bodies and how they're going to work. Because we don't have sanctioning bodies.
Oh, and the part that I love, here's the part that I love. Let me read it to people. The definition of a sanctioning organization. Sanctioning organization. The term sanctioning organization means an organization that sanctions professional boxing matches. You're like, great, that was so helpful.
Well,
they use the word in defining the term. Okay.
I told you it's a given in boxing, so it's a.
I know. Right. No, sorry. Go ahead.
It's like it's a circle. It'll be fought in a circle or a ring, and like, well, do we have to describe that? No, because everybody knows what the hell that is in boxing. But MMA, it doesn't exist. One thing, there was a sanctioning body. There's been a couple besides WAMA, but the UFC used to have a sanctioning body for like one or two cards back in the 90s. They had the Ultimate Fighting Champions, the International Fighting Commission or something like that, the IFC. If anybody remembers that, that was their sanctioning body they started, and then I guess they decided to throw it out because they figured we don't need that. That no one's going to stop us. They're not going to force us to sanction the bouts.
Yeah, piece of random trivia. But yeah, I know you're going from boxing where everybody already knew what that was to a sport where nobody knows what it is. Yeah. And so they defined it as, if you're an organization that sanctions basically what's going to be professional boxing matches and combat sport competitions. Okay, what the hell does that mean now?
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, it's really, because it could be, and this is the part is, again, everybody's worried about, because fans love the fact that the promoters set the matches they want. Fans love I think a lot of fans love the idea of the simplicity of the UFC champion. It just seems like a league and everything. But from a fighter's point of view, they definitely want, I guess if you're just take anybody, I guess Ben Askren is like the ultimate case. If you're Ben Askren and you're blocked out, you want an avenue to get a chance at the title, because that's huge money you've lost out by not getting a shot. If you're a John Fitch that has to win 7 fights compared to 3 for someone else, you want that straight path. And the same with and fighters want the ability that they don't have to sign with the UFC. I mean, there's no doubt it's almost a direct assault on the UFC. That's what it is. It's an attempt to say that a fighter doesn't have to sign with the UFC to be considered the #1 fighter.
Yeah, if we take that to mean that sort of mandatory matches in some way, shape, or form could be scheduled according to independent rankings, and if you have exclusivity clauses in your contracts, those would be void for these bouts. Then yeah, I mean, again, if I were a fighter, it's probably something I would want to see. Right. I mean, because it's, you know, especially the ones who constantly complain that they don't get the shots, even though they're winning, when they might not be, you know, the most exciting fighter in the world, but keep winning.
Oh yeah, or I guess someone like Rory McDonald who takes the fight, but he doesn't think he got paid enough.
Right.
His last title fight. I mean, that, you know, in boxing, you never see that because you got to negotiate that purse again for the title fight. You're going to see a Rory McDonald probably would have made, you know, 5 times what he made, 10 times, who knows? But on that front, it makes, you know, but again, it's the confusion factor. We don't know if it's going to have any impact or not. And
yeah, I have a hard time seeing them pass legislation that would violate contractual exclusivity. I could be wrong, but I'm just not sure. I wonder what it would mean within an organization, like within the UFC in their rankings. I have a hard time seeing the model where it would say no matter what organization you're with, if you're #2 here, you have to fight #1, or if the sanctioning organization says you're #4, you're now fighting #1, no matter what organization you're with. I don't know. Do you see? I can't see that world happening.
I don't see it. I mean, the dream situation for a lot of fighters, the dream situation, which we've talked about before, which will never happen because the UFC would be giving up so much money. The dream situation is the UFC to become the sanctioning body of all MMA. Guess what? Then everybody's fighting for under the UFC because everybody's fighting for a UFC belt. But you have multiple promoters bidding huge amounts of money to get a shot at a UFC title.
Right.
So you got, Dana White competing with Scott Coker, competing with Bjorn Rebney to put on the John Jones versus Daniel Cormier fight, and these guys are suddenly making a fortune. And that's the dream situation for probably fighters, because they all are going for the most famous belt, the most prestigious belt. But it's not going to happen. And I don't know how. I don't know how. I mean, it's obvious that's what they want. That the Mullen and his supporters want some form where the promoters are forced to work together whenever someone's 1 and 2. That's kind of their goal. But that's beyond my pay grade. We'll have to get some experts. Maybe we'll call some boxing guys and see if there's any. I talked to, like I said before, I talked to Liam Margulis and guys from Top Rank and Blue DeBello before, but we never got into this specifics.
Yeah, I don't. So from what I've seen in the draft so far, I don't see that happening. But it also depends on how that coercive provision contract gets interpreted. Yeah. Right? Because that's one that I guess it wouldn't require cross promotional bouts, but it can open people up possibly, depending on how it gets interpreted, to getting out of their contract sooner or becoming a free agent sooner.
Coercive contract, the first, if you read it specifically, it only really affects a boxer that's not currently under a promoter signing with that promoter for a specific bout.
Right.
So yeah, and we should point this out too, because I saw a lot of people talking about how the Ali Act will only allow for 1-year contracts.
I don't know. I don't believe that.
That's a complete misinterpretation of what the 1-year limit is the option clauses they're talking about. And again, those are specific about a boxer signing with a boxer who's now with the promoter, signing with that promoter for a bout, having a 1-year contract. Long-term contracts are still allowed under the Ali Act. Long-term, contract. The original Ali Act said there was a 5-year limit to any contract. After that, it was sunset provision limited any contracts. That's the part that Harry Reid supposedly cut out. But there's the 1 year is only for options. It may be under the interpretation I've heard some guys say it could probably be applied to this is stuff like the championship clause that says 1 year or 3 fights.
Right.
You could put a maximum of 1 year on the championship clause, and because most sanctioning bodies have like a 9-month or 12-month requirement to fight, that would be 1 fight, not 3, under your championship clause, which actually would have a big impact on fighters, because there's a big difference going into your last fight knowing if I'm champion, I only have 1 fight left compared to 3, the promoter is going to kick in a lot more money to sign you with 1 fight and compared to 3. In addition to all that, the other thing that a lot of people are ignoring is this bill isn't specific to MMA. It doesn't expand the Ali Act just to MMA. It's written in a way that obviously makes it that it expands it to probably grappling. First of all, it has to be professional. It only affects professional prize fighting combat sports, but to grappling matches and kickboxing. And so industries that weren't even on the radar, that probably didn't even know about this or even thought about this being a possibility, might not be drafted into inclusion in it. So I wonder what those guys are thinking. And I wonder if they're affected at all by it, actually, tell you the truth.
Yeah, and the question, I think I was having a little debate about this with Eric McGrecken on Twitter, but of how much of an impact this would have on grappling organizations like Metamoris and Eddie Bravo Invitational, since they aren't generally defined as a combat sport where a blow is struck to the head, but now in with this legislation, they are part of the one or more martial arts components of what makes a combat sport competition. And so given that you're in this legislation, all of a sudden athletic commissions now have a role in your life where they didn't have one before. They have one based on the procedures, right? With medical procedures, we know that for sure. Even though it might not be in the state athletic commission's codes, all of a sudden, if you're in this federal act, does the athletic commission have to do their typical medical procedures, right? Of getting the documents, approving
your national license, use that national ID, that's
card.
included.
So if they're involved in your world a little bit, does that sort of force the state code to change, or do they fight it? Like it's unclear what involvement the athletic commission is now going to have in your life, but it appears by this law that there will be something. And then Eric was obsessed with trying to find some workaround through them, even going to amateur sanctioning organizations and whatnot. And I don't know about that, but it certainly appears that the state athletic commission is invading your world in some way, shape, or form, and I would imagine that they would conform to eventually including you as a combat sport. But I don't know. I could be wrong there.
Well, to me too, the other interesting is kickboxing is so below the radar. I mean, the sanctioning bodies in kickboxing seem, the titles on that, like Glory. There's really only one major kickboxing organization that comes to America anymore. It's Glory. What does Glory do with their titles?
Right. Oh, but now we're talking about the whole thing, right? If the sanctioning bodies are involved.
Yeah, we got that. We got, you got the firewall. You got the ranking system. Who's going to rank? Independent ranking of grappler. Well, I guess the other thing too is, does it affect grappling? Because what titles they have bogus titles. And does grappling events? Does Eddie Bravo and Metamoris, they need titles?
I know, right?
And they're not real titles. Sometimes they're just like a one-match title. Like, oh, for this match, the winner gets this, the trophy. Okay, yeah. It's not a permanent thing. So,
And you've got athletic commissions who still have a lot of those boxing remnants left over, and are going to be doing grappling rankings. I mean, I realize there are a lot more people involved in grappling now than there used to be, but still, I don't know how much. I wouldn't want to rank grapplers, that's for sure. I would have no clue.
I think most people, even people in grappling, wouldn't even know who the hell to follow. I mean, how do you watch it? How do you rank somebody you've never seen?
I know.
People are dominating tournaments you never watch. They're not, they're not easily accessible videos sometimes.
And again, it falls into this element where these are the organizations that really aren't going to have the power to make any changes to this. To me, they're relying on this not passing, or the UFC lobbying heavily against it. And again, I don't think Viacom's like, I don't know what Viacom's like.
Although, of course, on the opposite end too, from all the stories from different grappling tournaments, how bad the promoters kind of treat the grapplers, but it's, financially.
Yes.
So maybe those sort of protections might be a benefit in the sense that they'll know that the money's there or not.
Yes, if it turns out that athletic commissions fully engage in these promoters' lives, right? And beyond just the medicals and stuff like that, do you have to issue your promoter bond now where we know you're going to pay your athletes? I forgot to mention that. Yeah. That, you're right. I'm sure all those Metamoris guys would love that.
Yeah, there's a lot of cases that, especially in those events that are not overseen at all, that they would love to have. And two for those events too. I mean, a lot of those promoters, kickboxing, plead poverty. Maybe they're broke, maybe they're not. That's you would like to see what kind of money's coming in. So there could be a positive on that. But it's again, it's a can of worms. I think very few people have. We should get Dave Walsh and the liver kick guys to be looking at how's it going to affect kickboxing.
Yeah, and if you are a promoter tight on money, and now you have to put this money up in advance, whereas before you could run your show, get the money, and then pay people.
Yeah,
that might be a big issue on your business too.
Well, I guess they might start with the UFC does, which is have contracts that pay out a sum of money. People might not know this, but some of the bigger stars, not everybody, but a small select few fighters have huge comparatively. We got to be careful because we're boxing not as big, but they have large sums, bigger than their show money, side deals, and those are usually written to be paid a couple weeks later. And part of the reason for that is that the cash flow, as UFC, they don't have to pay out in advance. Now they can wait for that money to come in from advertisers, TV, whatever, and then pay out the money without dipping into their own funds at all. Because,
if all I know is if I was running a grappling organization, I would be a little bit pissed at all these guys. I know you love MMA. You love MMA and you love the fighters, but I'd be like, why the hell did you guys bring me into this?
At least could you put like a grappling exception for everything? Like the one part, maybe you have one section covered by grappling, the rest not.
Yeah, I know.
You're just that. We'll take that part, but the rest can leave us alone. We can leave us out of that kick, yeah. But that's interesting. But then the other thing we were talking about before the show started is how, again, one thing is boxing, and it's true. People always argue the Ali Act is never enforced in boxing. And it's by the feds, it's never been enforced in boxing. And the athletic commissions almost never enforce it. The enforcement is almost always mandatory by the promoters, partly because they're afraid of perjury charges, because there's, it's part of the Ali Act on some of the provisions that you could be up for perjury or serious, for lying about contracts and stuff like that. But the biggest enforcement in boxing has been the right of private action, and it's been done. Not a lot, but it's been done enough. I mean, that's how Manny Pacquiao got out of his original contract signed with the Top Rank. So that seems to be the strongest level of enforcement. For everybody worried about it, it's not. I don't think it's really going to be the commissions and the federal government stepping in and really forcing this stuff down promoters' throats. I think it's going to be the right that certain fighters are going to take advantage of this and file lawsuits, and they'll have law now that they can point to make quick cases that say you are in violation because it says right here you have to do this and you didn't.
And have more leverage than they otherwise would have had to get a settlement where maybe they get out of their contract, get a better deal, This can is another piece of leverage that could possibly be used against promoters to help fighters advance whatever cause it is that they're after. Right? Whether they just want to be gone, whether they want better terms, whatever it might be.
And then the other thing we were talking about, this seems to be part of the motivation why it's being so. The people trying to form a fighters association are the ones really pushing this, and this is the reason they're really pushing this, is because an association can't strike. But what can an association do? They can file lawsuits and support members, and the filing of the Ali Act gives an association its members a lot more leverage than they'd have without it. And so that's why I think it's really being pushed by those guys, because this is their major tool to force change on the promoters.
Yeah, you said that off camera, and I thought it was a really, really good point, especially with the history that we know of Rob Mazy and how he's interacted with the UFC, and he was behind California Bill 2100 that ended up going nowhere, that ended up failing. And he's behind the antitrust lawsuit, and now he's behind this, right? And that it could give his organization, give fighters a reason to join his organization, give him the power that he needs, right? Because I think we keep hearing, well, why do I need to join an association? Why would I need to pay dues when they can't collectively bargain for me and stuff like that? And when you have this ability to go after people's to file lawsuits on behalf of fighters, and then possibly get a settlement that can help the fighter in whatever they're going after, again, better terms or getting out of their contract. And all of a sudden it gives Mazy and his organization that value.
Yeah. And again, and yeah, the other thing too, it also gives an incentive because it only really comes in effect and becomes useful if fighters join the association, so it can be enforced. That's the rebuttal of the day. That's our only rebuttal.
Right. I know. The problem is, at the end of the day, I'm still skeptical.
Yeah.
I'm still skeptical. I mean, I think it was a stronger start than I thought we'd have in the beginning. My read on it is he basically said we're going to throw a little bit about MMA in there, but
I'm talking about Mullen now, right?
Yeah, Mullen. I'm going to apply the manager promoter firewall to pretty much every fight unless they can find that workaround to 11 minutes. I'm gonna leave sanctioning bodies in there, even though nobody knows what the hell they are in MMA and if they even exist or if this mandates their existence. But it was at least a strong first offer in the sense that if I was the UFC, oh, this is one other thing we need to talk about. Imagine these potential buyers now, right? If I'm a potential buyer of the UFC, or even one of the people who maybe is going to buy 15%, my theory, the first night I heard of that sale, right, was I think it's a chunk of the UFC going to the Chinese group that's best situated to help them break into China. You give up a portion of your business and you can try to get the political connections you need to expand into this huge market. But if I'm a potential buyer now, and I know that this legislation is out there that is somewhat ambiguous and maybe has the potential to blow up the industry, even though that might be slim, are you willing to put forth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars right now? I mean, I'm no billionaire, but I wouldn't. It would seem to be a little bit too risky at this moment.
I mean, look, we got from Dave Meltzer and Darren Rovell. We've got some pretty good finances the last couple of years of the UFC. There's a big difference between buying a promotion that's making a third profit margin, close to 30% profit margins, and one that's making a lot less than that. If you're going to put $4 billion in, you expect those type of returns. Otherwise, it's like, well, if it takes 50 years to get my money back, why the hell am I doing this? So I would be a little hesitant. I might put a little pause button on that and say, let's see how this turns out, if this comes through or not.
I would. I mean, I mean, unless it's the guy, maybe the guy's worth 20 billion and we're talking about a 15% purchase. Let's say we value him at $4 billion, so $600 million. So chump change. Maybe you throw that out there and take a risk. But if I'm buying the whole company, there is no way I'd do it right now. If I'm buying if I don't have a ton of money, so that this is a small percentage of my, let's say, bankroll, I don't take that risk right now with this legislation out there, even though the likelihood, the percentages are I think it's almost 0% that it gets passed by January 3rd, if you ask me. But then when it gets in the new Congress, the question is what will happen then. Imagine these guys negotiating right now. If I'm the potential buyer, I'm very concerned by this, even though it's probably a low probability outcome.
And you got to worry too that in the era of Bernie Sanders and Trump and people just going on these outrages over the money class and inequality, that something like this might just spark and take off. And so, next thing you know, like, oh my God, there's a ton of support for this because it's the common man versus the big billionaires. But the other thing too is kind of interesting is, for the fighters' point of view, it's a benefit to them if it prevents UFC from selling. And I know a lot of guys are like, oh, I hate Dana White and Lorenzo and all this stuff, and they, good riddance. But no, from a fighter's point of view, if the UFC sells for $4 billion, the new owners are not suddenly going to go, oh, we're going to start paying more. They're going to go, no, we got to get our return back, and we're basing our return on the numbers they've shown. Dana White, Lorenzo Fertitta, and his brother, they've already made a lot of money. If anybody's going to concede some money, I'd expect it to be them to say, well, we've made a lot. We're willing to, instead of losing it all, we're willing to give up some because we're still making a lot of money. We can make some concessions. A new owner is not going to make any concessions because they got to make that $4 billion back.
Oh, a new owner, yeah, absolutely. So I'm still sticking with the 15%, 10%, 20% break into China. Try to make it there. But yeah, I agree on the huge purchase. Yeah, I mean it is. It's the private equity thing. They have to have some way to turn it around. Well, not turned around, not that you're doing bad, but you don't necessarily have to cut costs. I guess if your plan is really to generate the additional revenue and the additional profits off of China. Again, it just seems like such a huge untapped market to me. But yeah, they're definitely not going to be willing to. I agree with you. Not going to be giving up that much.
Yeah, we're again, like we said, Dana White and Lorenzo, they've made a bunch. They've already made much more than they put into it. So if anybody's going to make concessions, they probably will compared to a new owner. But that's my thinking. Who knows?
They don't seem like the type of guys to give up money under any circumstances.
Yeah, well, that's that's true. I mean, they got where they are because they are very tough businessmen from all accounts.
But I would love to be a fly on the wall in these conversations now, though, because I mean, I guess they knew it was coming, but I mean, all right, I've been involved in discussions with people at companies who are going public, and they get concerned about going public just before a presidential election, right? Like even this one coming up, there are going to be a lot of companies out there concerned about going from private to public, wondering what's going to happen with equities markets depending on who becomes president. And so, I mean, these types of things really affect their decisions. And this is not a minor issue. To me, this legislation is not minor. I really want to know how it is affecting these discussions because I cannot imagine they're just waving it off like it's not.
And actually, this is a bit more. This could be a more profound change than even losing the lawsuit. The lawsuit's money. If you pay the UFC $4 billion, but you have it written in that the previous owners are required to, they're responsible for whatever's losses, you could outright lose the lawsuit, and they could be awarded $750 million or some huge amount, treble damages, $2.25 billion. Guess what? That comes out of Lorenzo and Dana and their pockets and Flash Entertainment's pockets. You paid. It doesn't affect you. You just got to make sure you don't make those same violations in the future. This could potentially, as we said, it might not do much, but the way it could be interpreted, it could profoundly, completely rip apart your whole business model. And at that point, it's like, well, shit, we've lost a lot more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's risk. It's added risk that a buyer is not going to like, essentially, right? I mean, we all know that. I mean, running this whole thing is risky, and putting on pay-per-views is risky, but this is just another element of risk. Potentially, again, I don't read it like that fully, but you never know. I don't think you read it like that fully. Potentially industry changing that we know buyers are going to like. I cannot imagine the UFC brass in their offices are very happy that that legislation went out last week.
Yeah, I bet you they were hoping it would wait to the end of summer if this sale was really going through over the summer.
Right.
Like, why couldn't you wait to August?
Right. I can't imagine also they're not filtering money into Mullins' district. I really, because if it all resets come next congressional term and Mullins not there, we have to wonder what happens with this.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder how secure his position is. I also wonder who, what changes they're going to try to get to the bill, who they're going to try to do, what they're going to try to do to block it. I mean, they're obviously going to work to block it, to change it, to do whatever they can.
Yeah, I tried to look up on the internet like projections of how his race is doing. I couldn't find anything. All I could find was that the previous person was a Democrat, so they just switched from Democrat to Republican.
Yeah, Oklahoma's a pretty Republican state, but we won't know. I'm sure maybe he'll get attacked from the Republican side. Maybe they'll find a Republican to run against him.
I mean, it's possible. That's what you do, right? If you're the UFC, you lobby both sides if you can, because you just want that guy gone, and you sort of have this view of this legislation is anti-business. You can sell it like that.
Yeah.
Probably to some people at least.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, should we bring in our special guest? Is there anything else we want to add here?
No. We our special guest can probably add more than we can because they have firsthand experience with this.
All right. So for the first time ever, we actually have a fighter joining us. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. We're going to edit it out, so it's going to be a really short break. We'll be right back with Jamie Varner to share his views on what the Ali Act and this proposed extension means to him. Welcome back to Show Money. We're now joined by former WEC lightweight champion and UFC lightweight fighter, Jamie Varner. Thank you so much for joining us, Jamie. We're here to talk about get the fighter's perspective on the Ali Act as they know it and the extension, which we finally got the text of last week. So first question, Jamie, first off, do you support the Ali Act as you know it? And when you saw the text of the extension last week, was there anything new to you? What you've been told prior versus what you've actually seen?
So it's really unique. I never heard of the Ali Act before, probably about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, when I was approached by Rob Macy. He's kind of the guy that's heading up the big lawsuit against the UFC and really pushing the Ali Act. But the more I've learned about it, the more I'm like, yeah, there's no way the UFC is ever going to go for this. But I definitely feel like it's in the fighter's best interest. And had I had known that something like this existed back when I was in the WEC, when I was a young up-and-coming fighter, and even when I was a WEC world champion, this would have been this would have been an asset to me in my career, because it allows me, at that time when I was a WEC champion, I was arguably a top 5 lightweight in the world. So I could have marketed myself to Pride and Bellator and all the other promotions that were out there to see who would have paid me the most money. And I guess ultimately I kind of got stuck with the WEC, and my contract wasn't very good. It just would have been nice to have that open market to be able to market myself, because as we all know, fighting isn't a very long career. I mean, I don't know how Dan Henderson has been able to do it as long as he has and been so successful, but he's just one of the few. He's just an anomaly. But for myself, I 100% support the Ali Act, and I wish I would have learned about it earlier on in my career, because it definitely would have benefited me.
Okay, well, speaking about, let's ask some specific provisions. What specific provisions in the Ali Act do you think would have benefited you the most?
I would say the independent rankings would have been nice. Not that there were independent rankings back in the day, but they didn't. I don't feel like the UFC really used those. There was MMAfighting.com. There was a couple independent rankings out there that had me in the top 5, top 3. It just all kind of depended. Fighters Only had me up there pretty high. So it would have been nice to maybe have an independent ranking that encompassed all of MMA, as opposed to having like each magazine or each website having their own individual rankings, but have kind of one that was an independent that everybody like looked at as like, yes, these are the rankings. That would have been nice. I like the fact that it's disclosing how much money, I guess one of the provisions is disclosing how much money that the promotion is bringing in, and essentially they're making off of us, even though it doesn't tell us like all their expenses, but we would know, at least have an idea of gross revenue, because all promoters cry poverty. They're all the brokest guys, no one's ever making any money, but yet Dana White's got a brand new Ferrari, but they're not making any money. They're broke. The UFC's been losing money for 10 years, but Dana White's got a new Bentley and a new Ferrari, but they're not making any money. And I am driving like a used, Honda Accord, and I was a world champion.
They're just channeling the tech company formula of make absolutely no money and be worth a few $1 billion. That's all. It's all tech companies. So what's your take on the firewall provision? And it's supposed to apply to competitions that are scheduled to 11 minutes or more, which I think in any sort of major MMA promotion is pretty much every bout. What's your take on that? And do you see this? What do you think the influence will be or the effect will be on the smaller promoters out there?
And be specific, the firewall, for people listening, the firewall is between a promoter and a manager. If you have fights that last 11 minutes or longer, you cannot manage or have a financial interest in the fighter and be a promoter at the same time. So,
well, I think that's more relevant in boxing as opposed to MMA. I don't know too many agents. At least my agent, I was very blessed. I got a raw deal in the beginning of my career, but I was able to link up with Oren Hodak. He's the owner, founder of KO Reps, and he had John Jones before John Jones switched over to Malky Kawa. Jim Miller, Johnny Hendricks, Joe Lozon. He's got a lot of good fighters, and I was very fortunate to have him be my agent. He really taught me a lot, which most agents don't do. But to me, that didn't really – I don't think that really, plays an effect or a role in MMA. I know Dana White used to represent like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell in the very beginning of their contracts, of their careers, but I don't think that really plays a role in MMA per se right now, at least not in the big organizations. Except for that Ali guy in World Series of Fighting. I think he's the only one that I've heard of that it's definitely a conflict of interest, and I don't understand how he's got the job. Like, I mean, it's blatant. He hooks his fighters up with easy fights, and it's weird that they're always making twice as much money starting out as every other fighter that's just starting out. So other than him, I don't think it's really too prevalent in the MMA community or as far as the promotions go, but I definitely see like in smaller rings, like more regional shows, where that could come into effect.
Now, what about the provision for coercive contracts? I mean, the one that says that a promoter can't have in the contract an option of more than a year, based on if you take a fight. In other words, if you have to fight, let's say the independent rankings back in the day when you were fighting, and they put up a fight between you and the Champa Strikeforce, they couldn't demand that you have an option if you win that belt that your championship clause is more than a year. Is that something that would have benefited you or not?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Well, it gets a little complex to describe, but basically it says that the options on your contracts cannot be more than a year. So, like, a lot of contracts have a championship clause.
It prohibits the promoters from requiring long-term contracts in order to compete against its champion. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, basically the coercive contract provision.
Okay, so for me, they did a decent job of keeping me active for the most part. I think that would have benefited me though ultimately. When I was a champion, I was only getting fights about every 6 months, and then there was one time I had to wait a year. I had an injury, but I had to wait for Donald Cerrone and Vincent Henderson to fight, so I had to wait for the winner of that. Then one of them got injured, and Benson got his eye messed up, so we had to wait for him to get his eye fixed and have surgery. And so I guess that would have benefited me a little bit, but I don't think it's as big a deal to me as the fact that they just locked me up to these contracts, and I had really no negotiating power at all. And that's kind of one thing where the UFC or just Zuffa in general, they were kind of like almost like a communistic party. They very much so like a dictatorship, I guess I should say. I won my world title, and I thought when I beat Rob Cola that I fought Rob for like I think it was $9,000 to show, $9,000 to win, or $7,000 to show, $7,000 to win. It wasn't a lot of money, but I knew that I sacrificed a lot, and that winning, I thought I was going to be a millionaire. I win this fight, I'm going to be taken care of. I see Uriah Faber and Carlos Condit, and these guys are making this money. And at the time, when I won my world title, Uriah was a champ, but then Uriah lost his belt, and he was still like getting contract renegotiations. He was a no fear poster boy. He was a WEC poster boy, but he wasn't a champ. And I thought I was the world champion. I had just knocked out Rob McCullough, who he was one of the golden boys. Then I went and knocked out Marcus Hicks like right after that pretty quickly. So I had 2 knockouts in a row. I was on top of the world, I thought, at the time, and I had no negotiating power. My contract renegotiation was, all right, Jamie, we're going to give you $15,000 to show, $15,000 to win, and it's take it or leave it. I'm like, I just won a world champion. I'm making less money than the guy I just beat, and I'm making less money than the guys that aren't even champions, like Uriah and some of the other guys. Even Miguel Torres was making more money than that. So, but they seriously told me, like, it's either take it or leave it. And I really had no other option.
And what would have happened if you left it? If you said, I don't want that? What would have been your option?
Well, I was still under contract for 2 years. It was 2 years, and it was like 5 fights or 4 fights at the time. I can't remember the contract specifically, but I know it was 2 years, 4 fights, or 2 years and 5 fights, something like that. So, and I had just signed that contract when I transferred over from the UFC to the WEC. Joe Silva, he's like, hey, you're 21 years old. We got this new up-and-coming promotion. We're trying to stack it with talent. We want you to move over here. We'll guarantee you all your fights will be on TV. Just go ahead and move over there, and you'll be taken care of. And they offered me a $5,000 signing bonus to go over to the WEC, and they offered me more money. I was making, when I fought Hermes Franca, it was $3,000 a show, $3,000 a win. Then when I fought Jason Gilliam and I beat Jason, it was $3,000 a show, $3,000 a win, but then I would have moved up to $5,000. So they told me, go over to the WEC. We're going to skip the $5,000. You're going to go to 7-7. We're going to give you a $5,000 signing bonus, and all your fights will be on TV, and you're going to go 7-7, 9-9, 11-11, and it was like 13-13, 15-15. I think is how the increments worked at the time. And so I just signed that contract when I had one fight with Sharon Liggett. Then like a few months later, I think I fought Sharon Liggett in August. I fought Rob McCullough in February. So I still had another year and a half on that contract. So I would have pretty much been sitting on the bench for a year and a half not making any money. So I kind of had to sign that contract.
No, I guess the other provision that's the big part, and this is kind of has to do with the independent rankings, is the question, does the Ali Act mean you need to have sanctioning bodies? In other words, would it benefit you if the UFC, WEC, Strikeforce, all those promotions didn't have control of their belt? In other words, to get a chance at the championship, you wouldn't have to sign with that promotion, just that the sanctioning bodies would say this guy is ranked enough he can compete for the belt. Is that superior or inferior in your opinion?
I guess to me, it's kind of limited because that reminds me of boxing. You're pretty much talking like an IBF or WBC or WBO. Yeah. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Kind of, yeah. Basically,
yeah.
I guess there's a question too.
No, I think ultimately that I don't know, because I think it's kind of nice. Let's say for me, ultimately, I could win. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
I think for me, ultimately, as a fighter, it would have been cooler for me to fight in the WEC, win a WEC championship, then go to the Strikeforce, win a Strikeforce championship, and to go to UFC. So I could have all those different belts. Personally, I would have rather had that. But if having a sanctioning body, if like let's say it was Ultimate Fighting Championship or the MMA world title, I don't know, just the MMA lightweight world title. If that would have been the belt and that would have been the only one, but Strikeforce could have offered me a contract to have me fight against one of their guys for that belt there, or UFC or WEC, I could see how that would be beneficial, and I wouldn't have minded it. But I guess the ego in me wants to have all the belts. So if I had the choice of one belt or having multiple belts, I would choose multiple. But if that one belt made it possible for me to ultimately maximize my opportunity to make more money, I would go for that.
Okay. Paul, question?
No, it's not. So talk to us a little bit, going back to the original, or John's first point, how did your sense of free agency change over the years? So you mentioned in the beginning, in the early years, you were... Oh,
you're breaking up, buddy. I can't hear you.
Hello? So you mentioned to John that in the early years, you felt like you had to take that contract offer from the UFC. Has your sense of free agency changed over time as you've gotten older, or when you got in the UFC the second time, or I guess what would be the third time? Were you stuck on one contract that whole time? In other words, has your manager played a bigger role? Have you become more aware of your contract clauses and free agency?
I don't know how many fighters you've talked to, but there's really not a need for a manager or an agent as far as negotiating contracts with the UFC, because it is 100% take it or leave it, go somewhere else. And when I had my contract when I came back and I beat Barbosa, I lost Lozon, took that fight on short notice. I came back and beat Melvin Gillard. I signed, I think, a 4-fight contract. Then after that fight with Melvin Gillard, what I was thinking is I would be making, they would offer me a contract where I would be making more money than the guys I beat. Like, that would make sense. If Melvin Guillard is making $40,000 and Edson Barbosa was making like 20 and 20 or 21, I was making 10 and 10. So it was 10 and 10 when I beat Barbosa. It went up to 12 and 12 when I fought Lozon and when I fought Melvin Guillard. But I thought after that, after winning those fights, those were pretty big fights. I mean, beating a guy like Melvin who had been in there a long time, beating just the killer. This guy was the second coming of Christ. He was, Anderson Silva Jr. And beating those two guys and then having the fight of the year with Joe Lozon on 3 weeks' notice, I was on a bar stool, weighed 190 pounds, and in 3 weeks, hey, you want to fight Joe Lozon on Fox? I may as well need to close out my tab, go to the gym, and start training, guys. I got some weight to lose. But I thought after doing all that they would have offered me a better contract. Again, at least pay me what the guys that I beat were getting paid. Well, they ended up offering me a contract that was still $5,000 less than Barbosa, and it was a third of what Melvin Guillard was getting paid. Melvin Guillard was getting paid 40-40. I went from 10 and 10 to 15-15. It was a ridiculous contract, and there was no negotiating. I called my agent, called my manager. The manager at the time was Mike Constantino. He was representing the Miller brothers. He had a bunch of the guys out there in New Jersey. He was the one that was dealing with the UFC, and my agent was Oren Hodak. He's the one handling all my sponsors. And I guess he was able to talk to him. We were able to get to 17-17, and they're like, we'll do $3,000 increments. So it'll go 17-17, 20-20, 23-23, 26-26, and then, we'll renegotiate you after that. I'm like, no. I'm still making less money than the guys that I beat. I want to at least be making what Melvin Guillard, and it makes sense. I beat a guy that was making 40-40. I should be getting paid at least what he was getting paid. But I thought 45, 50-50 is where I thought the numbers would be. And it was, Jamie, it's either this or you sit on the shelf for a year, wait for your contract to expire, and we try to go see what Bellator is doing. And at the time, Bellator wasn't under what Scott's last name?
Coker.
Scott Coker. It wasn't under Scott Coker. And they weren't really offering big contracts. They weren't offering a lot of fights. I was hearing some horror stories about Bellator. A lot of guys like Lyman Good were sitting for 8 months to a year not getting fights. So it didn't really make sense for me to say F you to the UFC to go maybe Bellator, maybe make more money, but not have as many fights. So I just trusted my management. I'm like, all right, I'll take this contract now because I really don't have many other options. Take this contract now, and then maybe, just maybe, they'll pay me what I deserve at the end of it. And that Melvin Guillard fight, I ended up re-signing that contract, but I tore ligaments in my thumb. I was out for 8 months. And so they automatically signed me that new contract. Then they signed me to a contract extension, which, again, I had to sign. If I didn't sign it, it was okay, well, even when you are healthy, we're going to make you wait another 6 or 8 months to kind of starve you out ultimately. And it's they don't go on saying that, but they're we don't know, well, if you don't take this fight or if you don't do this, we don't know when we'll use you again. And so, we all know what that is. It's a threat without threatening. Do what we want you to do, or we're going to find something else. We're going to find somebody else who will. So I guess to answer your question, it would have been nice to have a little bit more negotiating power with the contract, but I never experienced it. It was definitely a total dictatorship, or take it or leave it, go try and find something better.
I guess in an optimum world, what would have been the best situation where you think you could have got the most money for your value, that you could have actually negotiated the best contracts?
I think setting up super fights with guys like BJ Penn, Sean Shirt, some of the champions that were in the UFC at the time, doing super fights like that, doing super fights with the guys over in Japan like Gomi and some of those good guys. Even I think it was Elite XC was around, Strikeforce fighting guys like Josh Thompson. Setting up super fights with those guys where the promoter, ultimately what the Ali Act stands for, where the promoter's like, hey, Jamie, we'll give you $100,000 to show, or we'll give you $300,000 flat, or we'll give you $500,000 to come over and fight Josh Thompson for undisputed, or for the Strikeforce title, or undisputed world championship for the MMA world title, or whatever. Yeah, I think that would have been the ideal situation for me, just to be able to market myself and be able to have the promoters compete against me. Because you got to remember, it wasn't like, not to say anything bad about Ben Henderson or Frankie Edgar or something. I wasn't going out there and eking out close decisions. I was knocking guys out, and I was putting on exciting fights. Whether I won or whether I lost, it was fun, it was exciting. And most of the time, it's like I either whooped their ass or I died trying. Trying to go for the finish, I get caught or whatever. But nevertheless, it was exciting. I was never one of those fighters, or like one of those fights where, oh, Jamie Varner's coming on. This is the time where I can go to the bathroom, or Jamie Varner's coming on. This is where I go get my drink, or I go make myself a plate of food. No, when you knew when I came on to fight, anything could happen. This guy could knock the dude out. This guy could choke the guy. This guy could break his damn ankle. This guy could get knocked out. You never know what was going to happen with me. So that's why people tuned in. And I ultimately think that made me a marketable guy, and ultimately could have got me paid a lot more heavily.
So let's assume that the Ali Act extension isn't going to pass. What advice would you have for fighters today on the business end?
It's so funny. I'm only 31 years old, and hindsight's always 20/20. And God dang it, I wish I knew what I knew now back then. I think we can all say that about just decisions in life in general. But as far as business goes, I wouldn't have bent over backwards and sacrificed so much to try and earn the favor of the UFC or Zuffa. I took the Joe Lozon fight on short notice because they wanted an exciting fight, and I was confident I could beat him. But 3 weeks notice against a guy that was top 10 in the world, when I'd been drinking for the past 2 weeks, partying with my friends, celebrating a pretty awesome victory over Edson Barbosa, I wouldn't have done that to gain favor. I wouldn't have taken the Gleason Tebow fight. That was a fight I took on like 6 weeks notice. I was coming off an injury where I tore ligaments in my left thumb, which it kind of sounds silly, but you kind of need your thumb to grab onto stuff. And I couldn't grab onto anything, and I tore ligaments in the salad joint. When you take your hand and you pop that knuckle or that bone right there, that joint right there, I tore ligaments on both sides. So my thumb was just kind of flopping around. And then also the Abel Trujillo fight. These are all fights that I took on short notice that gained favor with the UFC to try and hopefully earn more respect, but also show them like, hey, I'm a company guy, I'm a company man, so you can count on me if you ever need somebody, so pay me more money, give me a better contract, which ultimately they never did. They never did much for me after that. So my advice would be to the fighters coming up is be smart about your career. Don't take fights on short notice unless you're absolutely ready. Don't need to try and gain favor of the promoters. You don't need to do that. You need to focus on yourself, and it's okay to be a free agent. It's okay to play the market, to see what somebody's willing to pay you. See what your true value is. And ultimately, Ben Henderson did it. He got paid a lot more money, and he got a lot more respect going over to Bellator than the UFC. And Viacom they got a lot of money, even though Spike TV isn't like they don't have. I mean, it's not a Fox, and Bellator isn't a UFC, but I do think they're comparable. They have a lot of good talent there. They do have a decent amount of exposure. I think the opportunities being with Viacom that owns MTV and all these other channels, I think there's a lot of opportunity there that it scares a lot of fighters. They think that the UFC is the only show, when ultimately it's the talent that brings the show. The UFC's done a good job of making the UFC the promotion, the marketing, this focus. If you look at boxing, the fighters are the focus. It's the Mayweather versus Pacquiao. It's the Cotto versus I don't know, Margarito. It's the Alvarez versus all these other boxers. That's them. They're the draw, not the UFC. So I think if anything, fighters should be a little bit more educated on, you guys are the draw. You're the reason why the promotion exists. And it's okay to ask for more money. Ask for more money. If they try to starve you out, be smart with your money. Don't go wasting, because obviously it's super limited. But test the market, test free agency. And that would probably be my advice to fighters, is test free agency and be confident in yourself and save your money.
Test free agency has pretty much been our theme here, right, John?
Yeah, no, I'm less optimistic about it than you. I guess the other question. Now, I remember when you retired, you talked about you wanted to start a fighters union, and then you got involved in like brain concussion, talking to fighters about that. Is this something that happened at the end of your career? You started thinking about other fighters and kind of your legacy, or is that something you've been thinking about for a while?
I've always been a very passionate guy. I think you guys, if you see my fights, even from the very beginning of my career, I've always been very passionate, been always very emotional. And I was not liked in the WEC because I was the guy that spoke his mind. And I knew there was a lot of injustice going on, and I knew I wasn't being treated very well. So yeah, I want to be a part of a union. I think we need one. There needs to be a body, or there needs to be people that fight for the fighters, because not all fighters are very educated, and most of us are so broke. We're struggling, starving fighters. I mean, I was living off of like $1,500 a month. I was lucky to find a sponsor paying me $1,500 a month, so I was able to train and fight to chase this dream of being a UFC fighter. And when I got that fight with Hermes Franco for $3,000 to show, $3,000 to win, it's not a lot of money. You can't hire legal representation. You can't hire an accountant to help you manage your money, because there's really no money to manage. But you really can't hire even a financial advisor to help guide you on a path to fight financial success and in like stability, or at least to be comfortable. And I think that having a body there to oversee these fighters, to represent them, to look out for their best interests, to help guide them along the way so they don't get taken advantage of, is something that's necessary. And I absolutely 100% agree that there needs to be one for Bellator, for World Series, for UFC. There needs to be fighters. There needs to be a fighters union. There needs to be a minimum salary. I really feel that there needs to be a salary for fighters. There needs to be bonuses for fighters. And I would even like to see a pension. These companies are making so much money, especially the UFC. I mean, they talked about their gross revenue being $600 million last year. They spent less than $60 million on fighters, less than. But this isn't talking about. And there's a lot of undisclosed money that they're taking in that they're not disclosing. They've made a lot more money than what they disclose, and the fighters aren't even getting 10% of that. And in what other sport, professional sport, do you see that, where the athletes get less than 10%? The NFL, I think it's a 60-40 split with the NFL. Basketball, NHL, I mean boxing. Even in boxing, it's like a 70-30 split. 70% goes to the fighters. I mean, it's just crazy that UFC is able to get away with this. And except for Strikeforce back in the day, their fighter payouts to the gross revenue from the show was so, there wasn't as big a gap as there is in the UFC, where it's like a 90-10 split, 90% promotion, 10% fighters. It was much closer in Strikeforce. So I don't know. I think that there needs to be a governing body. I definitely think that there needs to be a union, people looking out for the fighters' best interests. And, the whole brain concussion thing that was just simply me talking about the mistakes that I made early on in my career. I was training with killers, C.B. Dalloway, Ryan Bader, Aaron Simpson. I mean, even guys you haven't heard of, like Esteban Payan, and then Carlos Cana. I was training with pro boxers, and we were sparring. Ray Steinbeck, Steve Steinbeck. It's like these great fighters. A lot of these guys were bigger than me. We were sparring hard every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Every Monday was MMA sparring with little gloves, and we went 100%. Every Wednesday was boxing sparring. We went 100%. Then every Friday was kickboxing sparring. Went 100%, because the only way, and back then, at least in my mind and in our coach's mind, the only way to prepare for a fight is to get in a fight. So we would train like it was a world title fight every round that we sparred. And, you know, me having to retire at 30 years old, just what goes to show you that maybe that wasn't the best route. I went from never being knocked out, never being dropped, never being wobbled, to my Abel fight. I got knocked out by a shot that I got hit harder earlier in my career. I think I got hit harder earlier in the fight, but I think the weight cut and all this shit took its toll on me. And then the amount of concussions I've had, I was able to go get knocked out easier. And then my fight with Drew Dober, I hit head on the mat trying to throw him and knock myself out, which is, again, is something that I've done 100 times training and wrestling in high school and college. I've done those throws and landed on my head and rolled through with the guys and never knocked myself out. But once you knock yourself out and you've given yourself a concussion, you're more susceptible to getting more of those. And you don't necessarily have to get knocked out to get a concussion. So there were times where I'd be sparring and I would get hit and lights would go off and I would keep fighting and I would get dizzy. I have headaches, and I would have headaches for multiple days after sparring sessions. I just thought that was normal. It's just what happened. And I guess every time that stuff happened, when I talked to my neurologist, those are concussions. I didn't know they were concussions, but those are little concussions. And after so many, it's like you have a forest, right? You have an orchard of trees, right? And this orchard is fixed. So you got a fixed number of trees. And every time you get a concussion, those trees get knocked down. You cut those trees down, and they never grow back. So now you're stuck with less trees. So every time I got a concussion, I had less trees that, you know, they represent like brain cells. So I had less brain cells and less fibers in my brain to help protect me from those concussions. So your brain never really heals. So I went around and I started talking about the importance of, you know, being smart with your training, being smart with your sparring, maybe 1 day a week of sparring, doing controlled, focusing on drilling, because that's what we did in college wrestling. We didn't go live every single day. Not every single move was, you know, get a double leg and go live. We worked positions. We drilled, like what Dwayne Ludwig is doing. He's famous for doing these Dutch drills. You can get a lot more done with that than having to spar hard every day. So those are kind of like two different subjects, two different things. But I'm definitely an advocate for having a union. I would love to be a part of it. If there's one that ever comes to be, and I'm working with some people on trying to make that happen, I would love to be a part of that and work with fighters. That's where my passion is. I like to spend my life doing that. And then also with the concussions, I would love to do a lot more speaking to fighters, whether it's UFC or Bellator World Series of Fighting, and just kind of talk to them about their training. Because the last thing you want to be is 30 years old, stronger than you've ever been, more mentally tough than you've ever been, but not be capable of fighting.
And I guess get back into the Ali Act questions and stuff. When you talk, because you know a lot of fighters, you talk to them and stuff, what do you think is how much knowledge do you think most fighters have about what's going on with the Ali Act going through Congress, and how much support do you think there is for pro or against it?
They have little to none.
Yeah. Well, that was a quick answer.
Well, the fighters have little to no knowledge of it. I think the UFC has done a good job, almost like the Catholic Church of old, using fear to control and manipulate its followers. And nothing against the Catholic Church, but I mean they've used a lot of fear to manipulate and control scenarios and people, and to make things happen for them in their favor. And I think the UFC does a good job of that. They almost make the fighters insecure to where they don't think that they're capable of speaking out against them. They have total control. Like, again, if I said something to if I would have said no to the fight with Joe Lozon, or if I would have said no to the fight with Gleason Tebow, I was specifically told I would be sitting out for a long time had I not taken those fights. Had I at least not the Gleason Tebow fight. I didn't want that fight. I didn't want that fight. It wasn't a good fight for my style. I didn't like him. I didn't like where the fight was going to be taking place at. I think if I had that fight in LA or if I had that fight in Vegas, that would have been a little bit different. I didn't like that fight being in the Midwest where they tend to favor wrestlers a little bit more, even though I'm a wrestler. Gleason's a really big guy. The testing policy was a little bit more relaxed back then, which weird. Gleason Tebow gets caught for using PEDs. No one ever expected that to happen. Like, they didn't do random drug tests back then either. So I didn't want that fight because I knew this guy was using. He was a damn lightweight that looked like a middleweight. He was the strongest guy on the planet, and all he did was hold people down, and that's it. He made a career out holding people down, and I did not want that fight. And Joe Silva, in a roundabout way, said that if I don't take this fight, I am not going to be fighting for a while. And now, how long is a while? I don't know. But I've already been off the shelf because I'd had an injury. I was out for 8 months. But during that time I was out, as soon as I healed from my finger, my thumb took me about 6 months to heal. I wanted Rafael Dos Anjos. I called him out. I texted my agent. I wanted Rafael. I was asking for all these guys that I thought would be good fights for me. And they're like, oh, we're not going to give you this guy. We're going to give you Gleason Tebow. I'm like, I don't want the Gleason Tebow fight. I want somebody better. I want somebody different. I want, especially if it's going to be in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I want a better fight for me. And this was me trying to be smart and go against the grain, kind of stand up to the company, I guess if you will. And I was told that if I don't take this fight, I may not fight for the rest of the year. And ultimately, I was running out of money. I needed to take the fight. I was able to survive off of what little pay I was getting during that 6 months. But, I mean, trying to survive off a year when I fought Melvin Gillard for 12-12, $24,000 when 20% goes to my manager, another 15% goes to I had 20% goes to my agent or my manager. Then I had sponsorship money, which 15% went away. Then you have to pay about 30% in taxes if you have a good account. I know some people are like, oh, you have to pay 40% or 50%. You pay about 30% taxes because you got to be smart with your write-offs. But I'm not walking away with a lot of money. I basically walk away with half of what I earned. And that wasn't enough to live off of for a year. And I was hungry, man. I had just beat Edson Barbosa. I had a great fight with Joe Lozon. I asked to fight Joe Lozon again, actually. So I asked for Rafael Dos Anjos. I asked for Joe Lozon. They wouldn't give me either one of those fights. And they're like, well, we'll give you Gleason Tebow. And it wasn't just – I had no negotiating power. And dude, it really sucked. It was a terrible, terrible thing.
Jamie, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. John, do you have anything else?
No, that was good. We filled in a lot more time than we told you we'd use. So.
All right, guys. We had a few other fighters possibly lined up to talk with you today about this, but because we are inept in some ways, we couldn't make it work out. We'll save that for another day. We'd like to say huge thanks to Jamie Varner for being the very first guest on this show. And on behalf of John Nash, I'm Paul Gift, reminding you to keep doing business as usual.
Jason Cruz is in trouble. He might have lost a spot.
I know that guy's been in Hawaii for a long time too.
I know he doesn't deserve to be on the show if you're gonna be in Hawaii. That's not right.